So hello and welcome to part 1 of my Ultimate Bully review, where I nitpick, praise and scold everything I possibly can about the game. Now this is the very first part where I'm only criticising the story, and as this is a review there'll be some things that I say that you won't agree with, or you do. But remember, this is my opinion on the story, so if you disagree, that's fine. I'll only be covering the main story for the most part, but I'll start off by going over how Bully handled the story compared to other Rockstar games first. Now one of the ways Bully handles its story is it's broken up into 6 chapters, all taking place in different seasons, compared to the Grand Theft Auto series, which seems to be one long story with very little breaks in between. Now depending on how you like your stories, this may be a good or a bad thing. Like Grand Theft Auto is much more streamlined in its approach, like how GTA 5 manages to seamlessly transitions Michael's relationship issues with his wife into a debt storyline, which then also transitions into Trevor hunting Michael down after the heist. Now in Bully, the approach is much more broken up, like chapter 3 is set in winter dealing with one storyline, Johnny Vincent and his girlfriend, but then skips ahead a few months into spring and jumps straight into another storyline with Ted Thompson, the jock leader, instead, and a completely different storyline that is not related to chapter 3. However, chapters are the one thing that separates Bully and GTA's sphere of progression. Like I said, Grand Theft Auto seems to take place over the course of like a single month or so, and aside from minor map changes, there's rarely anything major like season changes, which is how Bully handles its transitions. Like when you look over the stories of Grand Theft Auto, you can kind of tell when a chapter begins and ends. Like how the first chapter of San Andreas is all about CJ returning home to impress Sweet and show his worth to the Grove Street families, but then abruptly ends when CJ is kidnapped by Crash, beginning the exile from Los Santos kind of storyline. Well, in my opinion, Bully's storyline gives me a proper feeling of storyline progression, with the game beginning in autumn and slowly progressing to summer as the story goes on, with the game even celebrating some holidays being given their own little side missions instead, and the map being decorated with Christmas and Halloween stuff. Now this is a really nice touch, as Rockstar don't really celebrate holidays in their games. Well, they do in GTA Online and Red Dead Online, but not their story mode game. Bully is the only Rockstar game to celebrate this to my knowledge, as we haven't seen any like celebrations in GTA 5 or Red Dead Redemption 2, or any of the other older Grand Theft Autos. Also, unlike some other older games, like Simpsons Hit and Run or Animal Crossing, which rely on the system clock to celebrate holiday, Bully's holidays are mandatory parts of the story, which, as I said in the previous video, can be hit or miss depending on when you play. Like for example, the Scholarship Edition exclusive Rudy storyline, the Bum Santa, is very unfitting when you play in summer. Now pretty much all the Bully storyline is incredibly light-hearted and fits in jokes here and there in most cutscenes. Now once again, this is a much more different approach from Grand Theft Auto, which has a good mix of both funny, serious and emotional cutscenes. Like in GTA San Andreas, where CJ gets to the garage from Claude and he goes on a rant about calling him all kinds of names. Now that's a funny cutscene, but earlier on in the story it had an emotional moment where CJ realised his childhood friends betrayed him. Now Bully doesn't have many serious moments like this, and I think it keeps a very consistent theme throughout most chapters, and keeps the same pace rather than switching up here and there. Now I'd say most of the serious cutscenes in the game, like when Jimmy gets expelled, and the final showdown missions. So if you love the gritty drama of Red Dead Redemption 1 or Red Dead Redemption 2, Bully's storyline might not appeal to you because it's much more comedic, light-hearted. Now one of the things that Bully has as well are side missions, which are usually their own little side stories which don't clog the main storyline with filler, nor do they interfere with it. You can do them in the middle of chapter 3, you can do them in the middle of chapter 4 after the entire storyline's beaten. Well, obviously once you unlock the missions, of course, you can't just start off chapter 1 and do, say, Edna's storyline for example. Now, a good example of this is the Hattrick vs Galloway storyline. With the exception of being one of the first missions of chapter 2, this storyline doesn't add or take anything away to Jimmy's story, but instead expands upon 3 minor character storylines instead. And even then, it's not just a single mission, it's a series of missions which have breaks in between. Well, if you do them when they become available, that is, which I think is great since it doesn't shove the entire story down our throat at once, and also gives a bit of character development to characters who don't have a role in the story much. Now, I also think this may have helped pave the way for future Rockstar games that had side missions, like Strangers and Freaks in GTA 4 and 5, and the various side missions in the Red Dead series, where those missions would follow a similar structure. You could start them when they become available, but you could also do them after you've beaten the main game, or you could just do them as soon as they become available, that kind of stuff. But enough about the side missions, let's get on to reviewing the main story with chapter 1. Anyway, the first chapter focuses on Jimmy's arrival at Borth Academy and how he's adapting to his new life, alongside trying to meet new people and make some new friends, as well as being the victim of bullies for being the new kid. Now our story begins with Jimmy being dropped off at the gates of Borth, going on about his mother and a new marriage. Now what makes this a bit weird is how, unlike previous and future Rockstar games, the actual intro with Jimmy and his parents is the skippable credits cutscene that will play every time you boot the game up. So there's a chance many players may have skipped over this. The intro credits thankfully don't make you miss much, as it's mostly just dealing with Jimmy's strained relationship with his parents, and it's mostly just them arguing as Jimmy arrives in Bullworth. Now this cutscene I feel is a great introduction because it sets up why Jimmy's at Bullworth, It's not just a case of his parents just decided to send him there or whatever, it's because, well, as we can kind of tell, Jimmy and his family don't seem to be the best, And going off Jimmy's first line of "Mom, why'd you marry that phony?" it indicates that Jimmy doesn't have the best relationship with his mom's new partner. And of course, if you pay attention to the entire intro credits cutscene, we learn that Jimmy's there for an entire year. So it's not just a case of, Jimmy just being dumped there because his parents don't want him or anything. And of course, this chapter is also where Jimmy gets taken into Bullworth by Miss Danvers. Now, in this chapter, we're introduced to some of our main characters, like Pete, Gary, Algernon, Dr. Crabblesnitch, who all seem to play some kind of role in the first chapter, some bigger than others. Now, the pace of chapter 1 I find to be really fitting for new player, as the game starts off really slow, and seems to get most of the tutorials out of the way in the first few missions. Like how Welcome to Bullworth gets our fighting and wardrobe out of the way, This Is Your School is all about interacting and how the clock works in the game, and the setup, which is like the third mission in the game, is a great early mission to put new player skills to the limit, as well as doing a great job at solidifying the bullies as our antagonists for chapter 1. As we have a very basic mission, but it's also the first kind of mission which sort of throws you on your own. You do get reminders, but nothing like, Davis is standing there, this is your chance. Now the next few missions of Save Algae and Slingshot do a decent enough job at introducing the player to timed missions and how to use ranged weapons. Now I'd say that most of this chapter's missions don't really do much in terms of story building per se, but rather spends more time introducing us to characters and how to play the game. A bit similar to GTA San Andreas, I'd say, where the first portion of the story is teaching us how to play and dealing with CJ settling back in Grove Street. The only sort of story we get in here is learning how the buddies sort of like try to make life hell for the nerds, and us to an extent, but also as well with Gary Smith being hell bent on his plan to take over the school. There's not really much to it, as these missions are just sort of like help this person or whatever. So yeah, this chapter isn't really the strongest of story building. However, that being said, near the end we have a mission called The Candidate. Now this mission is probably the worst mission for story content, because in The Candidate, Jimmy meets Ernest Jones, the nerd leader who's running for class president, against the jock leader Ted Thompson, and pays Jimmy to defend him from public humiliation as the jocks are planning. Now this mission is a great one, as we see these posters scattered around the academy since the game began. We see their faces plastered everywhere. We know that something big is coming involving these two. You do feel like that this will be a storyline that will somehow tie into the main story, with the buddies, or maybe it'll come back in the future. But nothing ever comes out of this mission again. Not even in chapter 4, which is all about Ted and Ernest. It just feels like a massive waste of time. So yeah, this mission doesn't even have anything to do with the buddies per se. Like granted, it does introduce us to Ernest, one of the better recurring characters throughout the story, but it doesn't do anything for Jimmy's story involving the buddies or Gary's plan to take over the school or anything like that. It just seems like Rockstar had an idea for a story here, but they just decided to throw it all away for some reason, and all they decided to keep was just this one mission. Now after The Candidate, it's Halloween, and we see a rather impressive change around the academy, as Jimmy, Pete and Gary decide to spend the evening playing pranks on everyone. Now I feel this mission is another introduction mission to how pranks and errands work. Like in this mission we have errands about sticking kick me signs on people's backs and using Volcano 4000 fireworks and all that. But I appreciate how this story gives us a bit of break from Gary's semi-serious takeover of the school plan and the antagonistic bullies one, to have a bit of comedy with Jimmy nearly blowing students up with Volcano fireworks. Now the outfits that Gary and Jimmy wear are very clear references, with Jimmy's being a reference to the Karate Kid and Gary's being a reference to, well, let's just say the Germans from 1939 to 1945. And I can't see any clear reference for Pete. Now the next morning, Jimmy finds Gary acting really weird in the lounge, where he mentions finding something amazing, and Jimmy needs to come along. Now this is a good mission for building mystery, as we have no hints to what Gary's up to. After attacking 3 bullies for seemingly no reason, Gary lures us into the basement, and this is where we get a really good sense of mystery. Like, what is Gary up to here? What's he actually found? His constant cryptic comments of "you're really gonna like this" don't help either. Now after getting us through the basement with Gary's snide remarks for how to progress to the next room, he lures us down a really weird sewer kind of place. Now I remember the first time I ever played this on PS2, I did not want to go down there, because I felt something was really off, like we was about to get ambushed by the buddies. With Gary's vagueness and how far in the basement we were, it builds off a massive sense of tension, distrust and mystery, and how Gary pulls that off fantastically. Starting off as "I wonder what Gary's found" at the beginning to "I don't trust this one bit" towards the end. Now once you go downstairs, for some unexplained reason all of the school kids are down here, and Gary publicly accuses Jimmy of going against him. So Gary set up a fight between Jimmy and Russell, in full view of everybody. Now I think Gary's betrayal was to be expected of how he treated Pete and everybody else he comes across in chapter 1, you know, of how he abuses the homeless man, he bullies Pete, he's bullied Algernon and all that, but I think betraying us by getting us beaten up in front of everybody is a good way to get that betrayal, and Russell in the hole is our first boss fight without the game holding our hand like previous missions. We're not told when to attack or what to do, it's purely up to us and what we learnt in the first chapter, and I think it's a decent challenge, especially if you became unprepared and you're on low health. And Russell also changes up his attacks halfway through the fight, so newer players may be caught off guard by this. Now our chapter comes to a close with Jimmy realising the fight was a waste of time with Gary berating him in front of everybody, and Jimmy and Russell make amends, which brings an end to Jimmy's beef with the bullies, a great boss fight all around and the best way to end our chapter. In chapter 2, I feel the story was a lot more streamlined with the chapter directly carrying off fresh from Jimmy's fight with Russell and how it seamlessly transitions into Jimmy's story with the preppies, beginning with Gord offering Jimmy to come and visit their boxing gym. Now while the vast majority of this chapter is Jimmy dealing with the preps, I feel there's a sudden shift in tone as the first 2 missions take place on school grounds dealing with Jimmy's punishment handed to him by Dr. Cravelsnitch, and then the chapter directly gets onto the preppies. But to me there doesn't really feel like there's a natural shift between Jimmy being punished and him deciding to drop by the preps gym for Gord's invitation. Now the missions of Preps Challenge, Race the Veil, Carnival Day and Last Minute Shopping do a great job of putting the town of Bourne to good use, and I would say that these missions are sort of introduction missions as to what Bully has to offer in terms of outside story content. For example, Last Minute Shopping introduces us to stores, Preps Challenge introduces us to the boxing minigame, Race the Veil shows us bike racing, and Carnival Day introduces the carnival and what the player can do there. Now I really did like the approach Bully took here as it felt rather seamless and didn't really feel forced at all. Now this chapter's story is a decent one at best as it mainly focuses on Jimmy's rivalry with Tad Spencer and Gord Vendome, with constant showing up between them both. Well, technically both because Gordon had a friend, so yeah. Anyway, and what I mean by this is they constantly try and show each other up, with the preppies trying to publicly humiliate Jimmy, to Jimmy showing them up at a bike race, to the preps nicking Jimmy's trophy. Now our story with the preppies really begins at Preps Challenge, where after entering and winning the boxing competition, Jimmy goes to the boxing gym to hang out. So it appears Jimmy did take Gord's offer up on hanging out. However, when we get there, Gord is nowhere to be seen, instead we have somebody here called Tad Spencer. Now Tad offers to take us along to egg Mr. Hadrick's house, which is some nice continuation from the beginning story with Hadrick vs Galloway. And our only task is simply just to take some eggs to Tad's house. Simple enough. Upon arriving however, Tad confronts us about some comments that Jimmy apparently said about his family. And Gary arrives from the shadows to reveal that it's him who's been talking smack about Jimmy and what he's been saying about other people's family. Now what I like about this mission is it has that classic Rockstar kind of foreshadow looking back, you can clearly see it kind of feel, as you realise Gord was never going to hang out with Jimmy. It was just a setup by the preps to egg Jimmy publicly because of Gary causing trouble. It's also with the eggs you can start to see the game up its difficulty a bit with more people attacking you at once, attackers you can't see, and the game is offering no more hints for you. Now after escaping Tad's yard, Jimmy returns to the dorm to see Pete watching TV by himself and wondering where everybody is. Now Pete somehow knows Gary got the preps to egg Jimmy, and the pair have a small chat about Pete being happy he had friends for once, to which Jimmy tells him he's not alone and basically he is his friend, which is nice. And then Jimmy drags Pete to a bike race when Pete tells Jimmy that's where everybody, and I use that term very loosely, is. Now when we get to the race, everyone turns out to be 3 preppies and 2 girls. Anyway, this mission just serves as our introduction to races really, there's not much to it. However, after Jimmy's victory, the next mission ties in incredibly well to this, only to have it stolen by Gord and we go and beat up Gord and some of his preppy friends up to get it back. Now I think this mission is where our rivalry with Jimmy and the preppies starts to boil up a lot, and I think it's handled incredibly well. We have our reasons why the preps hate Jimmy, because according to them, Jimmy said stuff about their family, he's beat them all up, and then he's beat them in a race, and he's beaten them up again. So you know, we actually have some valid reasons as to why the preps hate Jimmy, and how Gary's antagonistic ways are actually working quite well. Now after this, Jimmy encounters Russell bullying the local shopkeeper for calling him dumb. And even though we can go through the entire story without ever seeing this guy, he knows us as Egg Kid. Now that could mean that Jimmy was the guy who egged that Australian senator, I don't know, maybe it could be, so who knows, we've got our Egg Kid after all. But regardless, it's a bit of inconsistency, especially if you've never been inside the old Ball Vale shop. But either way, he suggests we egg Tad's house in revenge, and Jimmy takes Russell as backup. Probably the most stereotypical teenage revenge mission in the entire game. Now after this, Jimmy laments with Pete about how he can beat the preps, and Pete suggests boxing Biff Taylor, one of the preppies' best, to show them all that he is better than them all. And we're thrown into a boxing boss battle. Now what I like about this is it's different than fighting Russell, as we only have our boxing move, so we can't deal with Biff using weapons like we probably would prefer to. Now this fight is great and all, but personally I feel it's a bit too easy, and I didn't feel the fight was any more difficult than the boxing challenge from the beginning of the chapter. Now after our victory, Jimmy is busy gloating, and the preppy leader Darby Harrington comes out from the sidelines and is incredibly offended that a poor person beat up a rich person. So all the preppies decide to attack Jimmy here and now, and so begins our boss fight with Darby Harrington. Now chapter 2 had a good story and had some weight to it. However, one thing I didn't like about the story here is how underused Darby Harrington is. I would say he's like the polar opposite of Russell here, as Russell was a major antagonist throughout chapter 1, having quite a few run-ins with Jimmy, especially in the first few missions. However, Darby's first actual mission appearance, minus the quick introduction one, is in his own boss fight. Now I feel this was handled horribly, as Jimmy spent the chapter rivaling with Tad and Gord mostly. Darby just seemed to show up out of nowhere at the end. Now unlike Russell, I didn't feel there's much of a point to have Jimmy fighting somebody you've never met before. That being said, Darby's boss fight was actually great and pretty challenging when you first play, because you're never instructed to block the doors, so you keep getting bombarded with preppies. But I do wish more was done with Darby's character to help build him up as an antagonist instead of just shoving him in at the last moment. Like the Pinky plot could have tied in as to why Darby wants to beat Jimmy up, like say Darby's angry because Jimmy broke a family tradition of the Harringtons, which is also mentioned earlier, which also led to Darby's family blaming him, and seeing Biff beaten, knowing what Jimmy did to Gord and Tad, pushed him over the limit. I don't know, there's some reasons for Darby to hate Jimmy I guess, as opposed to just, you beat up my rich friend, let's beat him back to the ghetto. Now for this part I'm going to gloss over the Santa storyline because I'm saving that for when I get to reviewing Scholarship Edition as part of my ultimate review in the next video. Now anyway, this chapter mostly focuses on the greaser leader Johnny Vincent and his relationship issues, which I think is probably the most realistic chapter in the entire game. Now looking back on my school and college years, I can definitely say that Johnny's storyline isn't that unrealistic. Anyway, the first part of the chapter is all about Jimmy helping Johnny, which has a different approach to Russell and Darby as they were portrayed as antagonists, and I think I'll repeat what I said in my Johnny critique as it covers how I felt about chapter 3. Now when Jimmy travels to New Coventry, we meet Johnny for the very first time, and we learn an awful lot about Johnny in this minute-long cutscene. Within the first 20 seconds we learn Johnny is incredibly paranoid, accusing Jimmy of laughing at him behind his back, and Johnny becomes increasingly angry before quickly coming to his senses and revealing the reason why he's so angry, because of his girlfriend Lola cheating on him. Now we actually got a very subtle hint towards the storyline in chapter 2, in the mission Movie Tickets, where Gord and Lola are waiting in line at the movies. It's not uncommon for Rockstar to add in foreshadows and hints in their games, though this hint wasn't so subtle when you look back on it. Now this scene is a great introduction to Johnny in my opinion, as it shows Johnny isn't like the other people we've met in the game so far, and he could be a very dangerous character. Everyone else Jimmy has met so far hasn't been as violent or as paranoid as Johnny is. Russell only attacked Jimmy in the introduction because Jimmy beat up his friend Wade, the preps only attacked Jimmy because of Gary's room spreading, but Johnny just flat out accuses Jimmy and puts hands on him in the first scene we meet him. After Jimmy gets the photos for Johnny, we see Johnny is understandably irritated, once again getting angry at Jimmy just for talking, and then plotting his revenge on Gord, which is to round up his friends and beat Gord up, which does succeed. After Gord's beaten, Johnny has two reactions, a cheerful reaction and a slightly more angry reaction. Now in my opinion this is another great mission to showcase how dangerous Johnny is. Unlike other cliques which usually deal with people in a one-on-one scenario, Johnny just outright sets Gord up for a beating in an abandoned park in Greaser territory where none of Gord's preppy friends can really help him. Okay, Gord was with Tad and Parker, but they also got beaten up. Either way, Gord and the two preps being beaten up in this abandoned park, then being left there as Johnny, Jimmy and the Greasers leave, is a definite sign that Johnny is someone you don't want to get on the bad side of. Now personally, I think the sudden shift from helping to going against the Greasers was a bit sudden. Like I can see why Jimmy would be helping the preppies, but the Nerds mission is probably the weirdest one in the entire chapter, as Lola was going after Chad and Algie, even though the entire chapter storyline was supposed to be about Gord and Lola. Now I get Lola's supposed to be a slut and all that, but it's never brought up again and you could probably erase wrong part of town and this would be the exact same storyline. I get how it kind of explains how the Greasers know Jimmy is going against them, but maybe swapping out Algie for Gord, or I don't know, even Chad for Gord, and have this mission being given by Darby, and it would have been a hell of a lot better, since it would have also tied into the preppy Greaser rivalry. Now after helping Algie and Chad escape, we have another tutorial mission for the basic art of graffiti tagging, halfway through the game might I add. Now I feel this was handled horribly, as halfway through the game we should know everything by now, Like, imagine if halfway through Red Dead Redemption 2 in Chapter 4 we only just learned how to hog tie NPCs, or if in Grand Theft Auto we only just learned how to buy your own cars. Now, in my opinion, this could have been handled in Chapter 2 with, say, I don't know, Jimmy tagging up Tad's house as revenge, alongside egging him. Now, after this mission, Lola and Johnny are having relationship issues at Lola's house, which is in the middle of the road, so either Lola is homeless or this was a weird design choice from Rockstar, and Jimmy and Johnny have a race to prove who's better and Lola goes as the winner. Now, one of the things I always felt was rushed was how Jimmy went from helping Johnny to being in a relationship with Lola himself, and I feel this can actually be explained by a cut mission, where Jimmy meets Lola while looking for Johnny, and she convinces him to help look after her and Tad. Now, this mission, while cut quite early, actually does explain how Lola and Jimmy know each other. Now, I don't know why it was cut, as I think it explains why Jimmy's going after Lola as well, instead of making Jimmy look like a backstabbing jackass to the one clip who are actually somewhat friendly with him, because in the cutscene Lola is being really flirty with Jimmy, and you can see by the end he's somewhat fallen for it. Now, the last part of Chapter 3 is all about Jimmy and Lola's relationship, where, surprise surprise, Lola isn't popular with the Greasers anymore after kissing Jimmy, Gord, Tad and pretty much everybody else, and she's been kicked out the Greaser hangout. But all of her stuff is there, and the next mission after that she dumps Jimmy and Jimmy doesn't care. Now, the Tenements itself is a really weird mission. Like, the story setup is very consistent with the story to Chapter 3, but the Tenements building itself is just really weird, though the outside doesn't even match the inside, which coincidentally also has an outside portion itself. So it seems like this entire building, or at least the outside of it, was changed and Rockstar never bothered to update it, and the Tenements is never mentioned again as the Greasers' hideout. Now, after Jimmy gets Lola's items, we learn that Lola's ways have caused a massive rift between the Preppies and Greasers, and while a good story arc, it's also a bit confusing. Like, the mission cutscene is Lola dumping Jimmy for not caring, yet the mission afterwards is Jimmy looking for Peanut, and once we find him we fight 3 Greasers. Now, I don't get this at all. At no point is it ever explained why Jimmy is going after the Greasers, made even more confusing in the Johnny Vincent boss scene, where the Greasers Jimmy just beat up aren't the ones he beat up. I mean, like, you know, when he picks up Hal, he wasn't even present at the fight. He's also gloating about how he's the boss now, but when Johnny arrives, he tries to keep Johnny calm. Even though in the mission just, Jimmy said he was going after Johnny anyway. Now, that's just really confusing if you ask me. Now, while I did love the Johnny Vincent boss fight, one thing that everybody wonders is, what the hell is Pete even doing here? He's never seen in Chapter 3 aside from the intro, he wasn't present in any of the missions, and yet he turns up here and none of the Greasers really seem to care. You know, I feel this part was really rushed to hell, or Rockstar just wanted to shove Pete in somehow to keep his supporting character status. Now, I really did like the addition of having Lola be the real antagonist of Chapter 3 instead of Johnny, because it's the only chapter where the clique leader isn't actually the bad guy for once, and Lola is the only female antagonist in the entire game, alongside being the only character who never gets any consequences for her actions. She gets away with everything, while Johnny, Gord, and to a small extent Jimmy, are the ones who are actually worse off for this chapter, because Jimmy was played a fool of, while Lola will probably keep going with others behind Johnny's back, making him worse mentally. Now, Chapter 4 seems to take place a few months after Jimmy and Johnny's fight, and begins with Pete being bullied by the jocks, to which Jimmy wants to get revenge on them and goes to see Ernest about helping them take the jocks down. Now, when Jimmy gets to the library, for some unexplained reason, Ernest and all the other nerds have turned on Jimmy for no reason. Stronghold Assault sees Jimmy storming the observatory to get Ernest on his side, but what was the point in this? There's no reason given to us about this, and makes even less sense as we know Ernest, and Ernest knows Jimmy. The closest thing we get is Ernest assuming Jimmy is there to beat him up, but even then that makes no sense as Jimmy went to speak to Algie, not Ernest. Definitely one of the weirdest story twists and one of the most uncalled for. Now, the next mission sees Ernest asking for Jimmy's help in acquiring photos of Mandy Wiles, and these photos come in the form of her cheerleading, Mandy in the shower, and Mandy shaving her legs. Now, this is without a doubt the most illegal thing in the entire game. While most people hate Ernest for doing this mission, I do think it's a good character building mission for Ernest, as it shows what a disgusting character he is. Now, if you want to hear my thoughts on Ernest's character, check out my character critique video on him. Anyway, inside the library, Jimmy is tasked by Special Agent Algie to help out the nerds at the carnival, as they're sabotaging the funhouse for the jocks' visit. But when Jimmy gets there, the entire plan has gone to hell and the jocks are attacking the nerds. There really isn't much to this mission, as Jimmy just beats up jocks and escorts nerds. Also, this mission is never mentioned again and it just feels really out of place, I feel. Now, back at the observatory, Ernest appears to be having a visit from Karma, as the jocks are there ready to kill him for the naked photos of Mandy he has, and some nice continuation from that disgusting story from earlier. And Jimmy helps Ernest fend off the jocks in an incredibly fun mission which I think sets some tension between the nerds and the jocks. Also, earlier I mentioned how Ernest turned on Jimmy for no reason. Well, that's a slight lie. The jock attack was the reason why Ernest turned on Jimmy, and the reason was because in the beta, Paparazzi was the first mission of Chapter 4, with Stronghold Assault being the second, which explains why Ernest turned on Jimmy, and why the Spud cannon was broken because Jimmy just broke it. God knows why Rockstar changed this, because it was much more consistent originally and explains everything so much better. What a pointless and confusing change that was. Thankfully, the next two missions are very consistent, with Discretion Assured, which is the ending to Mandy's humiliation caused by Ernest, and Nice Outfit, which also carries on with Ernest's plans to take down the jocks. Now, Discretion Assured is actually one of the nicer moments in the game in my opinion, as Jimmy feels genuine remorse about his involvement in Mandy's humiliation, and tags over all the posters Ernest and the nerds have stuck up around town of her. Now, it doesn't clear Jimmy's involvement in this, as he's partly responsible. Well, I'd say fully responsible in a way for not declining and willingly doing this anyway, but I think it shows one of his nicer sides. He actually feels genuine remorse for what he's done. He's caused humiliation to somebody that he feels didn't deserve it. Now, this mission itself is a bit basic, but it works well for what it is. Now, Nice Outfit is when Ernest's plan to humiliate the jocks begins, and Jimmy is issued with a simple task, which is to acquire the mascot outfit, and Jimmy does this by assaulting the mascot until he gives chase, alongside multiple jocks. But then Jimmy leads the mascot to the pool to fight him in a 1v1. How there is no one in the gym is beyond me, and I wonder how Jimmy even got out of the pool, as there was no way out, but I'm not complaining, as this plot point was great overall. After acquiring the mascot outfit, we reach our conclusion to Chapter 4, which is the big game, and this mission was definitely one of the finest ones Bully has to offer. This mission is definitely one of the funniest ones, as even the intro scene begins Jimmy catching Ernest fantasising over adult entertainment magazines, and I should keep me monetised. And the mission itself has Jimmy pissing in drinks, nearly causing murder, and supergluing arses to benches. This mission I think is the high point of comedy for the game. Now, the gameplay in this mission is drastically different as well, as rather than running around sniping jocks like we would expect to, we actually infiltrate them, use the mascot outfit to sabotage everything. We do have to do the cow dance whenever we get spotted by them, which I'll admit can get a tad annoying, but it's forgivable for how fun and hilarious this mission can be. Also, unlike every other mission where it's like go here, do this, we can actually choose what order we do them in. Each part changes stuff up nicely, and always shows the effects of Jimmy and the nerd sabotaging. It also has some nice detail, as preppies and greasers are incredibly hostile to you in this mission, as they don't know it's Jimmy. Now, this kind of mission really shows Bully's potential for some highly detailed missions, which sadly doesn't happen much outside of this mission and Save Algae, I believe. After sabotaging the Jocks game, we skip forward to what I assume is half time, or the end of the game, as Jimmy reveals himself to Ted and Damon, who threaten to kill him. Now, I've said my thoughts on this fight before in my Ted Thompson character critique, so I'll quickly replay that.
Now, speaking of the big game, I even found the whole boss fight to be really underwhelming too. Now, I know that's kind of controversial, don't get me wrong, the build-up was amazing, the mission before it was one of the best set of missions I've ever played in any Rockstar game, the atmosphere was amazing, alongside the soundtrack, which in my opinion, I consider to be one of the best soundtracks in all of Bully. But the payoff was just really weird and underwhelming. Like, we have Jimmy and the jocks throwing explosive footballs at each other, and then we get to fight Ted by himself, but Ted doesn't even attempt to fight Jimmy, and he's knocked out within a single punch. I still remember when I first beat him on the PS2 back in 2008, and I just remember saying to myself, what the hell was that? When it just seemed to abruptly end.
And yes, I'm aware that sack Ted means tackle, but as a Brit we don't get much American football over here, aside from the NFL Super Bowl, which I don't even watch because, you know, the sport doesn't appeal to me. Anyway, back on topic. And I didn't mention it in my Ted Thompson critique, but why is Pete here? Again, just like the Johnny fight, he had barely anything to do in this chapter, yet he's still here. This time, Pete's in an even more useless position, as he doesn't even help out in the fight other than just to tell Jimmy to take Ted down. At this point, I feel like Rockstar just wanted to remind us that Pete exists as a supporting character. Honestly, it's a bit weird just to shoehorn him into missions where he doesn't do anything. Well, okay, it's a bit of a slight lie, as Pete is happily celebrating with Jimmy after Ted's defeat, and I like the foreshadowing in the beginning where Jimmy says he'll kick Ted's ass publicly, and he does. Now, Chapter 5 seems to begin not too far from the big game. During the chapter intro with Jimmy's monologue, I always get the kind of vibe that this is the next day. Now, I don't know if that's because we were just in the pouring rain at night time and now it's a dry morning, and I think having the janitor mowing the lawn gives off that kind of vibe too, like he's doing some after-match care to the field. Anyway, our story begins with Jimmy and all the clique leaders, minus Russell, and Jimmy seems to have brought world peace to Borth Academy and is incredibly happy. I mean, we even see Darby Harrington and Johnny Vincent getting along, you know, two sworn enemies, greeting each other. It doesn't get much more peaceful than that. Now, our chapter begins with the power clearly getting to Jimmy's head as he thinks about how he can show Bullwolf he's the king and has a minded discussion with his newfound friends about what to do. And despite Pete's warning about remembering about Gary, they come to the conclusion that tagging City Hall is a great way to show Jimmy's the boss, and Jimmy sets off to do so. After single-handedly annoying the entire town with his offensive remark of Bullwolfless, a rather good pun on Bullwolf and worthless, Jimmy returns to discover everybody's angry and they hate him, but we're not told why. Now, I think this is a good way to approach Jimmy's downfall, as we're left wondering what happened. Did everybody find Jimmy's joke that offensive? Did Gary do something while he was away? It adds a bit of tension as we see our respect of everybody except the bullies fall into dangerous levels. Now, after this we make our way to the library to see the nerds too scared to enter, and there's a massive rat infestation and Jimmy gets blamed for it. Somehow. I really don't understand why Jimmy gets the blame here. Assuming this happened while Jimmy is vandalising City Hall, surely Ernest of all people can vouch for Jimmy not being responsible. Anyway, after clearing the library for the ungrateful nerds, it's discovered the rats only appeared once the new book delivery arrived, which also makes me question why Jimmy gets the blame. Like, assuming the nerds were indoors, surely they could see the rats coming from the crate. Like, Jimmy's a student, he's not employed by Crabblesnoots to deal with ordering books and supplies for the school. And as said, Ernest could vouch for Jimmy not being there. Anyway, after this Jimmy visits the gym and gets called alongside again by an angry Mr. Burton, who flat out accuses Jimmy of arson and burning down his gym. Once again, why is Jimmy getting the blame for this? I really don't see any actual reason for him to be blamed here. So Jimmy offers to go and save some students who are unfortunately trapped in the fire, and somehow the gym has more equipment in it inside the usual and piles of trash. Okay, surely whoever did this must have took hours dragging in all that trash and then setting it on fire. Honestly, Jimmy is not to blame here, everybody else is. Like, I bet if I went to drag that much trash into my local gym, they'd soon kick me out as soon as I dumped the first lot on the floor. The only people to blame here are the jocks for being that bloody stupid and Burton for being that bloody blind. Anyway, after rescuing everyone and putting out the fires, Mandy tells Jimmy she saw somebody downstairs who was responsible. When Jimmy goes to investigate, this person attacks Jimmy and then runs out the gym. Now, either Mr. Burton is that much of a hateful petty jackass or everybody is that dumb. But if I was near a burning building and I hear somebody run out the building saying I regret nothing and have somebody else point out that guy was responsible, I'm pretty sure everybody would realise Jimmy's innocence and give him a well-earned apology. However, they don't because, well, everybody's insert obscenity here towards Jimmy. So after this, Jimmy heads down to New Coventry and he sees Lola and Norton arguing over Johnny Vincent, who's disappeared. Once again, Jimmy gets blamed, and I'm not repeating myself again, but this mission has some nice detail to it, which I'll quickly replay from my attention to detail video which I made last year.
In the introduction to Chapter 5, we can see Jimmy conversing with all the clique leaders, Ted Thompson, Ernest Jones, Darby Harrington and Johnny Vincent. But then Jimmy goes to talk to Pete and all the clique leaders go on their way. The next mission, the first mission of Chapter 5, which is making a mark, the cutscene once again has all the leaders, except for Johnny Vincent. This is because within the next few missions we learn Johnny Vincent has gone missing and he was admitted into Happy Vault's asylum. His absence in this mission's cutscene is a very subtle hint that he went missing after the introduction to Chapter 5.
Anyway, this mission is definitely one of the creepiest in the entire game, as it's a stealth based mission where we have to break into the insane asylum, which we've never been introduced to in the game before. And this mission does a fantastic job at setting a mysterious tone with the ominous soundtrack. But I feel more could have been done with Jimmy finding the asylum. Like say having Jimmy ask around where this asylum is instead of somehow knowing where it is despite never visiting it. Also forcing the player to find their own way in instead of just marking the tree on Jimmy's map which he can use on his first ever visit. But, what can you do really? Aside from those small plot holes, at least Johnny knows his escape plan when Jimmy finds him instead of Jimmy somehow knowing how to escape and free every inmate. Now the next part of the story is where Jimmy first meets Zoe and the pair decide to get revenge on Mr. Burton for being a jackass and, well, being a pervert. Now, a bit of a weird mission for story consistency and the whole everyone hates Jimmy story, but I think it works well if you think of this mission as Jimmy getting revenge for Mr. Burton for nearly getting Jimmy arrested for arson he didn't commit. I think it's a really fitting mission for that reason only, and I think it's a great introduction to Zoe. Another weird oddity with this mission is how Zoe knows Jimmy's a Bullwolf student even if he isn't wearing a uniform. Now it could be a weird coincidence, but seeing Mr. Burton covered in waste is probably one of the most satisfying parts of the game, as we know what discussed in person he is in other missions. So straight after humiliating Burton, we're taken back to our Everybody Hates Jimmy storyline again, where this time Jimmy stops by the Preps boxing gym only to get accused by Darby for stealing boxing trophies, again accused with no proof at all. Darby thankfully then accuses the Greasers and then goes to declare war on them before Jimmy stops them. Now this cutscene works incredibly well as it plays off the preppy Greaser rivalry decently, and it also shows how the tensions around Bullwolf and the Academy are in this mission. Also, in this mission it's revealed the townies are behind everything, but I feel like the twist, if you can even call it that, isn't really that shocking when Jimmy meets one and the gym is burning, and Johnny mentions them after being freed from the asylum. I mean, it's, just not unexpected. After getting photo evidence of the townies burning the Preppy's trophies, Jimmy returns to show Darby his photo, and they basically argue over how Jimmy's to blame somehow. With Darby basically telling Jimmy to shove his photo where the sun doesn't shine, I think the ending does a great job of showcasing how stuck their own, the Preppies really are. They don't care for the truth, they just wanted an excuse to fight the Greasers for any reasons they could find. Also, you'd think of how rich the Preppies are, you'd think they would be able to afford some CCTV in the boxing gym. But seeing Darby's response, they probably could give less of a damn when they saw a Greaser involved somehow. Also, one thing that confuses me in this part of the story is how Jimmy somehow knows Gary's working with the townies. Like, we don't see or hear anything that hints at this, so either Jimmy's just flat out assuming this, or maybe there's some cut content where it's flat out revealed Gary is working with them. Maybe like the twist in GTA San Andreas where Caesar calls CJ and they find out Smoke and Ryder are working with Tenpenny and the Ballers. The next morning, Jimmy wakes up to a very angry Miss Danvers shouting for Jimmy to come into the office where Dr. Crabblesnitch knows Jimmy was behind the tag on City Hall, and proceeds to expel him. I think this is a great turning point, as it's very fitting to Gary's character and shows how desperate he was to take over the school, and he saw Jimmy as a threat, and seeing Jimmy having every click on his side probably added to that threat level. And by having Gary take his chance to snitch on Jimmy and destroy everything Jimmy's worked for, is a fantastic way to reintroduce Gary to the story as our main antagonist. However, around this point I have very mixed feelings on how Gary was handled as our antagonist. Like past chapter 1, Gary only appears twice, and in one of those appearances, Gary isn't even bothering with Jimmy compared to the other Rockstar games where we're always reminded of our antagonists who make regular appearances throughout the story to screw everything up for us. But Gary wasn't really doing that. Like in all the chapters we have different antagonists, Tad in chapter 2, Lola in chapter 3, Ted in chapter 4, and the townies in chapter 5. However, with that being said, from Jimmy's point of view, Gary was handled well, because Jimmy just does not care about him at all. I think past chapter 3 we clearly see Jimmy just forgets about him and carries on his year at Bullworth, and since Gary isn't making himself known to Jimmy, why should he care? As far as Jimmy's concerned, Gary's just a backstabber who shouldn't be trusted. So after being expelled, Jimmy rants a bit at Pete, and while they both know Gary was behind getting Jimmy expelled, Jimmy is unsure if Gary was behind the townies' antics, which does retract what he said to Darby, which is good since it makes more sense that way. However, once again we have another oddity, a bit like the Rumble where Jimmy says he's going to take on the townies and finds Russell. However, Jimmy doesn't know where Russell lives, nor does Jimmy know where the townies' hideout is either, so this mission is a bit weird like that. However, this can be somewhat explained by cut content again, where the original cutscene for this mission still exists in the game's files, and had Jimmy directly say his plan to bust into the hideout to teach Edgar a lesson, which to me implies there was a story change of how the townies were handled in this mission, or well, chapter entirely to be honest, especially since we've never met this Edgar. Now speaking of that, Edgar was handled pretty badly here. As soon as Russell launches a suicide attempt, Zoe runs up and Jimmy says, "I gotta talk to that Edgar kid," even though we don't know who this Edgar kid is, we've never met him or heard that name before. I think that furthers my point about how there might have been cut content for how the townies were handled for this chapter, or the shocking twist, but I just think it's a bit weird. Now as Jimmy makes his way to Edgar, we chase him through a power plant, for arguably the most badass fight in the entire game. I mean come on, we're in a chemical plant. Now after beating Edgar, he reveals the only reason why all this happened was because Gary told him they'd make everyone pay, which once again is never really hinted at, nor do we have any evidence, so I'll repeat what I said earlier. I don't see or hear anything that hints at this, so either Jimmy's just flat out assuming this, or maybe there's some cut content where it's flat out revealed Gary is working with them. Maybe like the twist in GTA San Andreas where Caesar calls CJ and they find out Smoke and Ryder are working with Tenpenny and the Ballers. Anyway, while Jimmy was busy fighting Edgar, the entire academy has erupted into World War III. Their complete mayhem is without a doubt the perfect representation of Gary's plans. I think this was brilliantly hinted at with Darby wanting to wage war on the Greasers for nothing, and I think all the different click encounters in this mission give us some very fitting insights as to why each click is fighting. For example, Ernest is fighting because Gary manipulated him into thinking they'll rule the school. Darby isn't fighting, but instead he's residing in Harrington House in a fancy robe and slippers, basically confirming he was just looking for an excuse to get his clique to fight, which was hinted at in Preppy's Vandalise. Now because Russell and Edgar are on Jimmy's side, the bullies and townies aren't participating in this war as they're aware of Gary's plans. Now of course this mission is exaggerated quite a bit of how every clique somehow being everywhere at once, and people being knocked out only to quickly run back in to the fight, and I think that kind of exaggeration works well in this mission. After issuing reminders to clique leaders about how they work for Jimmy, he enters a school to find Edgar, who's beating up some bullies, which works well as townies hate school kids and vice versa. But for some reason the prefects are in here and they quickly swarm Jimmy. You'd think they'd be going after Edgar, but I guess this is a sign they're under Gary's control, or they're just that incompetent. But after this, Gary taunts Jimmy and Final Showdown begins. Now I think Final Showdown and everything about this mission sets the tone perfectly, from the soundtrack to the dark rainy weather. I think it also does a great job at showcasing Gary's scenario, as he's now fallen and he's been chased to the point of no return. But Gary is finally going to get what's coming to him for what he did to Jimmy, and the cutscenes are fantastic at showing the tension between the two, with Jimmy confronting Gary asking about what he did wrong, to Gary saying Jimmy would have backstabbed him anyway if he had the chance. It really does highlight Gary's mental problems, and I think this was hinted at the reason back in chapter 1 when Gary says he stopped taking his medication. But having Gary's personal issues have been the reason how Gary turned out in the story is a really unique twist on the cliche antagonist, because you don't have a reason why Gary hates Jimmy, but his mental issues make him assume Jimmy hates him instead. The final fight between the two isn't the most difficult fight ever, but it works well because Gary himself is not a fighter. He's more of a thinker, and it shows of how easily he's taken down by Jimmy, who's had his fair share of fights throughout the entire game. Now as the scaffolding collapses underneath them both, somehow Jimmy is unscathed, and while Gary's knocked out on the floor with Crabblesnitch saying how Gary's now expelled, because he heard Gary's confession and list of crimes before the fight. However, I covered this in my theory video, but I don't know how Crabblesnitch got tied up without knowing it was Gary, unless either the townies did it or Gary himself knocked Crabblesnitch out just to tie him up. Now the ending itself is a decent one, as everyone realises Jimmy was innocent all along, well excluding the tag of course, but Jimmy also helps his friends by getting Zoe reinstated at Bullworth and getting Mr. Byrne fired, and Pete hired to be the head boy. I think the ending wraps up most things nicely, as Edgar and Russell seem to have helped break up the fights. Jimmy's ending monologue is short but fits the ending rather neatly, by saying everything is sorted out more or less. It's a good quote to apply with the side missions the player may not have done yet, and to wrap up some side stories for other characters. And the quote of "I'm not saying we're going to live happy ever after, but life is certainly going to get easier" is a good realistic quote to end with as well, as Jimmy's year at Bullworth is drawing to an end. But at the same time, life is going incredibly well for him. He's defeated Gary, he's gone reinstated at the academy, he's cleared his name, he's got himself a girlfriend, and at the same time, Jimmy's only 15, he's still got his whole life ahead of him, and we know life is never really a permanent happy ride. But our story with Jimmy ends here, on a very happy note as he's cheered on by most people at the academy, including the staff. Now overall, I feel the story to Bully is great and deals with some excellent character building and puts the entire map and cliques to good use. However, at the same time, the story is plagued with plot holes, inconsistencies and weird stuff, like the Ted vs Ernest election story, why Ernest turned on Jimmy in chapter 4, how Gary and the Tonys are working together and all that. This kind of stuff does ruin the story a bit, but I reckon most of it can be explained through cut content. But I don't think Rockstar had enough time to really fix the plot inconsistencies in time. But when Bully's story does remain consistent, it throws together some really good plots, and I like how they all vary from being realistic, you know, with like Johnny and Lola's story in chapter 3, and Jimmy being the new kid in the first chapter, to the unrealistic and slightly wacky, with like chapter 4 and the nerds defending the observatory from waves of jocks using spud cannons, or complete mayhem where all of a sudden there's like clones of everybody joining the fight, while somehow not being too out there either. Now Bully is not the most lore deep game ever, especially compared to other games like, you know, the GTA series or even some of the Fallout games like Fallout New Vegas. So if you really love lore deep stuff, Bully might disappoint you a bit there, mostly because there hasn't been a sequel or a prequel to it yet, so to be fair there is really no lore to go off yet. However, if Rockstar do decide to make a Bully 2 at some point, I hope they can tie into Bully 1 somehow, you know, like how all the GTA games are tied in somehow, or like, you know, Red Dead Redemption. So that's it for today's video. Stay tuned for the next one where I'll be doing the ultimate review of Bully from the gameplay perspective. So I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to subscribe for more Bully content, and if you want to support me in a more personal manner, consider becoming a member of my channel. That being said, thanks for watching, I hope to see you all at the next video.